Welcome to the first presentation on the war that saved my life. I'm recording this on Sunday afternoon. Daylight savings time has just ended, and I probably got an extra half hour of sleep. So I might be feeling a little bit groggy, and I might make a lot of mistakes during this one take effort, but I hope you can all stick with me. I hope you guys are enjoying this book. Um, it's certainly on the lower end of the reading spectrum compared to some of the other books that we have read. However, I think it is a kind of charming little book, and I think it does a lot of the same things that some of the, for lack of a better word, more sophisticated books do. And it has a couple of things that I think are really worth talking about. Let's just begin with the type. Okay. We are dealing with historical fiction. We have dealt with dystopian fiction. We have dealt with what would be best called contemporary fiction. We are finally dealing with something in an historical fiction. And I think that that's an important element of looking at any survey course that we get some science fiction, we get a detective book, we get historical fiction, we try to cover everything. As you can see on the slide, historical fiction should be set in the past. It should accurately reflect the era in which it is set. Second, it's not a history book, but it's usually an effort to place the reader vicariously in that past. Wherever that era is, it's supposed to transport the reader there. It's not 100% accurate. It doesn't claim to be 100% accurate. There are some key elements of any book. One of them is the setting. Historical fiction should be a real time and place, and it should often be set around a significant event. Kent, as I understand it, is a real village in England. World War II certainly happened. Dunkirk certainly happened. The Battle of Britain certainly happened. All of those sorts of um, things are key elements to this novel. Plus, since I know that Kent is a real village, a lot of the Battle of Britain was fought in the skies over Kent. So we have a setting that is real. We have a real event in a real town. And now we are going to look at fictional characters dealing with that real event. The plot details are going to combine historical and fictional events. So the blackouts actually happened. Rationing happened. The bombings happened. Dunkirk happened. Ada's contributions to the war effort are fictional. As much as I want a little 10 or 11-year-old girl to be able to do all of the things that Ada did, um, she's not going to be able to do it. Okay? Or if she, it didn't happen. It could be a composite of a lot of characters, but Ada did not do the things that she's depicted doing in the book. Other people may have, she didn't. The characters can either be fictional or historical. Obviously, as I said, Ada, Jamie, and Susan are all fictional. All of the characters are fictional. Um, but Kimberly Brubaker Bradley, in the Q&A at the end of the book, discusses the fact that she used many first-person accounts as the basis for the book. So even though these characters are fictional, much of what happened in the book is based on first person accounts, at least according to the author, and then she filled in gaps with her imagination, which makes perfect sense. The conflict should be accurate. The efforts to make Jamie write with his right hand, I think, probably strike all of you as funny. The teacher claiming that he's possessed by the devil when he's writing with his left hand probably strikes all of you as a little bit weird and bizarre. I grew up we went to school in the 1960s. Um, there were still teachers who worked hard to make everybody right handed. If there was a left handed person in class, the teacher tried to get him or her to write with his or her right hand. I don't recall anybody having their left hand tied to the desk, but there were efforts to keep everybody right handed. Certainly, the view of people with disabilities is, I think, an important element of all of that. That certainly happened. People on crutches, people in wheelchairs were certainly either sympathized with or uh, looked at with sympathy. I'll phrase it that way. And there was, I think, or there were a good number of people like Ma'am who believed that if there's a physical disability, there must be a mental one that follows. And I mean, I had a great aunt who never married, never moved out from her mother's house because her leg was one of her legs was shorter than the other, and so she spent her whole life on crutches and didn't seem to, have a social life outside of family. And then Susan's conflict with religion, I think being the daughter of a pastor who kind of forced religion on her, plus there were a lot of well-educated people during that time period who had well-known conflicts with religion. Those conflicts, I think, all are pretty accurate. Everything has to make sense for the time period. So in this novel, the social norms, including the class divisions, that has to make perfect sense, and it seems to me to be pretty accurate. Certainly, the difference between Ma'am and Susan, the difference between Lady Thornton and Susan, the uh, idea of the upper class doing their duty, the stiff upper lip, and all that sort of stuff, I think was pretty accurately done. The manners of the lower class, the effort to teach proper manners by the colonel, all of those things I think were pretty good. The Christmas goose used to be a standard, and certainly in Britain it seemed to be a big thing. The language, Ada's language versus Lady Thornton's language, I think again accurately depicts the time period and accurately depicts the place. The other thing I want to get to is another lit term du jour, the unreliable narrator. And I think there's two parts to the unreliable narrator. First of all, it's the unreliable narrator is going to reveal an interpretation of events that somehow differs from the author's own interpretation of the events. And usually, the reader should automatically see events or characters differently than the unreliable narrator sees those events or other characters. There are three types of unreliable narrators. First of all, there's the deliberate liar. They either omit necessary information or give um, false or skewed information. This type of character is, I think, common in books where it's a criminal telling the story. That I think is absolutely a perfectly accurate way of doing, of a perfectly believable way of doing the unreliable narrator. It just out and out lies, and eventually facts will come to light that allow the reader to see that this was all a lie. The second one is the evasive narrator. They tell the story, but they will never commit to a specific version of events. Okay, if you've read The Life of Pi, Pi sticks to his story fairly consistently about the tiger and the lifeboat. When you get to the end of the story and you see that there's a possible other version of events, Pi pushes back philosophically, but he never denies those other versions of events. And then there's the naive narrator. The naive narrator attempts to tell the truth, but is going to lack information, experience, education, or intellect to fully comprehend all of the events. When we take a look at Ada, there's always a possibility with first person narration that the narrator is going to be unreliable. The narrator is a character in the story, and the narrator may have reasons to alter or hide the truth. Also, because the narrator is a human character, the narrator is going to lack omniscience. The narrator is not going to be a clairvoyant and understand what's going on in people's heads. And so when you deal with this sort of situation, you are going to obviously see that there's always a possibility with first person narration, and therefore with young adult fiction, which is quite frequently narrated by a first person narrator, you're going to see that it's possible to have unreliable narrators quite frequently. Adolescent literature, as I said, has more reasons to suspect that the narrator is unreliable. The teen voice, which means that the narrator is young, and therefore the narrator might be naive. The narrator is trying to shape his or her identity, starting to take some control over his or her life. And as people are developing their identity, they are going to change. And as they change, you're going to see growth or digression, I guess, but regression, excuse me, growth or regression. And you're probably going to understand that what they see is not going to be accurate until they develop the proper identity and the proper subjectivity. Also, the fact that they're supposed to be a teachable moment, the readers are supposed to figure out that the narrator is unreliable. It does make it easier to be a teachable moment. In the previous books we read, I think we can look at situations where the narrator has been somewhat unreliable. We don't know if Q was ever honest about his feelings for Margot, or whether his descriptions of Ben and Radar and Jace are totally accurate. Todd spent his whole life in Prentisstown. Does that color his telling of the story? His lack of education, the things that the mayor was pounding into his head, and even in the Hunger Games. Would Peeta be telling a different story than Katniss? It's always human nature to try to make ourselves look good. It's always human nature to try to avoid accepting blame, I think. And so we can have plenty of situations in the previous book where we have to doubt the narrator. Previous books, excuse me. The purpose of the unreliable narrator is twofold. It's to allow readers to notice plot details or characterization they may not have otherwise noticed. And I think it allows the reader to care more about the narrator than they might have otherwise. I think we want to care about Ada because we see the effect that her disability and her mom's treatment of her because of her disability has had on her. And so as she is struggling, we see these effects, and I think that allows us to want to care more about her. Ada, I think, is certainly a naive narrator, but there's lots of reasons why she's a naive narrator. First of all, she's 10 or 11 years old. She's uneducated. She's been abused by her mother, and we can see effects of post-traumatic stress as she deals with the Susan being kind to her on Christmas when they're in the bomb shelter. She's been isolated for much of her life, sitting on a chair looking out the window. She's been malnourished for much of her life, and what effect that would have short term and long term certainly is open for debate. There's lots of reasons why we can consider her an unreliable narrator. And I think there's just three passages I'm going to hit. There's a lot of them in the book, but there's just three that I thought were kind of important. The first one, successfully resolved, I thought. My foot was successfully resolved. It sounded like I'd done something wrong. Ma'am always said my foot was my fault. I'd always wondered whether that was true. Obviously, her foot wasn't her fault. Obviously, her mother should have paid to get the operation, and we will see that her mother was indeed the reason she didn't get the operation. So it's not her fault, and yet she thinks it is. On page 177, there's a line, Susan tricked me into writing. And yet we can see the plot details where she was watching Jamie write. Susan had her do a little bit of writing, but then she grabbed the paper. She did everything so that she could write on her own. I wanted Ma'am to be like Susan. I didn't trust Susan not to be like Ma'am. By page 184 in the novel, I think all of us can see that Susan, although she's a troubled woman, and although she has her own issues to deal with, is not going to be like Ma'am. And Susan is not going to beat her. Susan is not going to lock her away. Susan is always going to make sure she's got food. Susan is going to make sure she gets medical care that she needs. All of those things. Um, but she's still got that mistrust. She is still admitting that she is not a reliable depictor of all of the facts. This about wraps it up for today. Um, we will pick up some new stuff in class on Friday. And remember that the quiz on this is next Monday. So I hope everybody has a good day, and we'll end this one right here.